I have a question. I was wondering what the northern boundary of the colony was and what the relationship or dealings with the people here in Manhattan as opposed to those further north were.
The northern boundary, do you mean up the Hudson? Probably somewhere around Saratoga or so forth, or maybe not quite that far. They eventually lay out a village in Schenectady. This is right in the 60s, early 60s, just before the English takeover. But the area to the north remains sort of a no man's land for a long period of time. And even in the 1740s, there's a Dutch document talking about the policy of the first Governor Clinton, George Clinton, that he has ordered all of the Mohawk Indians out of the Adirondacks, and the Dutch Indian agents say there are eyes and ears up there. It's like an early warning system against the French, who could come down at any time, which they did at one point in Schenectady in 1690. So it's they stay pretty much close to the river systems in the Dutch period. They maintain that that interest in the watersheds and being able to move things. The Dutch, if the Dutch knew nothing, they knew how to handle water, and they knew how to move things around on water and take advantage of water. And this is exactly what they were doing in the New World. They were taking advantage of the Hudson, which was the only other access to the interior of the country besides the St. Lawrence River. The Hudson-Mohawk configuration was the only way to get to the interior of the country until the Cumberland Gap is discovered or opened up by Daniel Boone in 1750. So it was a very important matter that they maintained control of the river systems.
Dr. Jacobs and also Charlie, I'm interested in what you said about projecting history and how we project the history. And I know in Dutch Reformed Church history, we tend to speak in terms of North America and the Netherlands, but we rarely look at comparing it or comparing the histories of Dutch Reformed Church history in Indonesia in comparison to North America, in Suriname, even in Brazil and so on. What about the other aspects of Dutch colonial history in North America, and how do we compare that to Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and so on? And has there ever been a cohesive picture of projecting these histories together?
The short answer to that is no. There is no cohesive picture. But what you're outlining there, that problem with comparing this colony with other parts of the Atlantic world, with the Dutch Republic, as well as with the other parts of the colonial empire in the East, for instance with South Africa or places like that, that is exactly my research agenda. So, you're spot on there. And I find it very interesting to look, you mentioned the Dutch Reformed Church, of course. If you look at the Dutch Reformed Church in Brazil, you see that there are a couple of differences, but the whole organizational structure is the same. And they are dealing with the same issues. For instance, rebaptizing people, and what are the demands on theological knowledge. The answers to those questions, and also the answers to questions like how can we convert, Christianize the indigenous peoples, the answers to those questions are not provided at the frontier in the colonies. The answers instead are based upon the theology and the theological discussions in the classes of Amsterdam. I've had contact with people who were studying the practices of Dutch Reformed ministers in dealing with the Mohawks in the early 1700s without even looking at what was going on in Amsterdam. You're never going to find the answer that way. So I feel that a too parochial approach in research, looking only at New Netherlands or looking only at North America and disregarding the relations with Europe and with other colonies will never provide proper research, in my view.
basic question, I'm afraid. Were there any interactions between the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company in terms of New Amsterdam? And if so, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the only interaction that I know of is Henry Hudson, who was working for the East India Company and laid out the boundaries, basically, of what became New Netherland. The West India Company, the place where they came into contact is in Africa, of course. What is it? Angola, I believe, was a part of the West India Company, but south of Angola you had Namibia and or South Africa, what becomes South Africa. That's the East India Company. But you don't see any, I don't have any documentary evidence that they're working together with trade or...
No, there's no interaction on that level. There is one political thing I can think of, the Amboina massacre in the East Indies, with the rumors in the 1650s that the Dutch and New Netherlands are going to do a second Amboina on New Englanders, which of course is entirely bogus. And the other connection is the plans to amalgamate the two companies, to have them merge in the 1640s, which are eventually turned down because the East India Company, which is prospering, doesn't want to take over the financially bankrupt West India Company. So there's a connection there. And the third connection is on the personal level. Many of the directors of chambers of the East India Company were also directors of the West India Company, or a family member was. These were all part of the elite of Amsterdam and of Middelburg. So on that level there were connections.